Hello again, I'm Hiro. Welcome back to my Glaive and Greatsword class. In this video we're going to talk more about mass combat. First thing I want to mention that I forgot to mention at the end of the previous video is when you're on the line, you still want to keep paying attention. Remember, battlefield awareness is important, so pay attention. And one of the things you want to look out for is opportunities to switch from on the line to skirmishing. And skirmishing is what we're going to talk about next. But first thing is, when you're skirmishing, you also want to be looking for opportunities to switch to on the line, whether your line needs reinforcement or whatever. So skirmishing I basically define as any time that you're not on the line. So that includes a lot of different things. That includes guarding your flanks against enemy flankers, or trying to flank the opponent, or hanging out in the backfield behind your line as sort of backup. And so we're going to go over each of those options. So when you are skirmishing, some things to watch out for. Number one, look for spear fighters, 9-foot spear fighters who are relatively undefended, and see if you can gank them. Alright, so a few ways to deal with spears. My preferred way, if I think I can charge them without them gacking me, then what I do is I charge and I don't thrust with my arms. I just let my body movement carry me into their center of mass. That's what I have found to be the most effective. An alternate method, especially if I'm attacking from this direction, is to knock their spear down and try to keep control of it until I can use that lever back edge offside head, which is actually more likely to hit them in the face instead of the offside head, but whatever. Shorter weapons are better for ganking spears because the difference in effective reach is smaller. So her effective range is about here. My effective range is about here, which is inside her effective range. Meaning that if I get past her tip, I have a better chance of success.
Because I would have to back up.
So this thing is 6 feet, but imagine I was using something longer than 6 feet. Then my effective range becomes right here, which is right in her effective range. So the difference between ranges is not big enough to make it work. So you can still gank spears with longer weapons, but it's just harder. It's easier with shorter weapons. So another thing to do when you're skirmishing is hanging out behind your line as sort of backup. So a few things. You want to protect the flanks. Make sure that if the opponent is trying to flank you, you can defend that flank. Also look for gaps in the line that you can reinforce. If the opponent charges and breaks through your line, then great weapons in the backfield are the best to kill those breakthroughs quickly before they can do too much damage. Again, watch your line, see where it needs reinforced. A lot of times, as the lines are engaging, it's better for you as a great weapon fighter to hang back a little bit and analyze the situation before you engage. So that way you can see weak points that need reinforcing, or strong points where you can, break the enemy line or whatever. Another thing to do when you're skirmishing is harassing the enemy line, forcing them to react to you. I'll discuss that a little bit more later. Also note that this advice about skirmishing mostly applies to smaller battles, like 50 people per side or less, because the bigger an open field battle gets, the more it starts to resemble a restricted terrain battle, which I'll discuss in a little bit. The restricted terrain battles means things like bridge battles and gates. So in other words, if you're at a really big war like Pennsic or Estrella or Gulf Wars, or larger battles are going to feel more like restricted terrain battles instead of open terrain battles. So restricted terrain battles, again, that means like gate assaults and bridge battles. Great weapons benefit from having room to maneuver. And because of that, I don't feel like they're quite as good in restricted terrain battles. They still have their place, but I personally would rather use a 9-foot spear in those kind of battles instead of a great weapon. Otherwise, restricted terrain battles are pretty similar to being on the line in an open field battle. So all the stuff I said in the previous video about being on the line, that stuff all applies to restricted terrain battles, plus a few other things, like if your weapon has protrusions for hooking, then hooking shields and weapons is usually more effective in restricted terrain battles than in open field battles. You can also try crouching down to see if you can get better angles from underneath instead of over top. And lastly, shorter weapons can be really useful in restricted terrain battles, especially during a big push where everyone's crushed together and there's not enough room to maneuver a longer weapon. Forest battles and broken field battles usually fall somewhere between open field and restricted. Alright, so next thing I want to talk about is delaying. And so the concept of delaying, the point of it is to keep multiple enemies tied up for as long as you can. So you want to keep 2 or more enemies focused on you, because even if they eventually kill you, then while you're keeping them tied up, their side is down, 2 or 3 or 4 people, while your side is only down 1 person. And so it's up to the rest of your team to take advantage of that, or to capitalize on that numbers advantage in the meantime. To delay effectively, you need to be hard to kill, but also hard to ignore. You can delay with any weapon, but I feel like great weapons are the best because they strike a good balance between being hard to kill and hard to ignore. Situations where delaying is useful. I already mentioned this one in the previous video, but basically when you're on the line trying to harass enemy 9-foot spears so that they focus on you instead of your allies. Every second that you keep them tied up is a second that they're not killing your buddies, which is a good thing. Another thing is if you see enemy flankers and you go out to engage them, try to keep them tied up as long as possible. If you can kill them, great, but really you just want to slow them down. And also make sure that you call out to your allies so that they are aware there's a threat over there that needs to be taken care of. You can also, flank or harass the enemy line. You don't necessarily have to kill them, but if you can get them paying attention to you and pull them out of position, then that weakens the enemy line so that your line can prevail. Again, and this is based on having room to maneuver. If you don't have room to maneuver, then the flanking thing doesn't really work. Use noise and body movement to make yourself seem like a bigger threat than you really are. So, if the opponent's coming at you, go, yeah, come on, let's do this, come on! Because that's going to cause them to pause for a second. Again, even if they eventually kill you, every second that you delay them gives your team an advantage. Again, I already talked about this in the previous video, but if you're paired with a 9-foot spear, then using noise and body movement to make yourself seem like a big threat helps draw attention away from your buddy, who's arguably the bigger threat. I also want to discuss weapon length really quickly. So I'm going to start with really long weapons. I don't have any really long weapons. My longest is 6 feet. But when I say really long weapons, I mean 7 feet up to the maximum of 7'6". So these really long weapons are good to use on the line because they're good for stabbing sword and shield opponents on the line. They're good for harassing and delaying enemies, especially enemy spears. They're really good for defending your 9-foot spears. Fiona, can you assist me again? I can stand back here and still defend Fiona. No, I stepped forward. Yeah, so I can stand back here and still defend her easily, and I'm out of range. So I'm basically safe. The downside of really long weapons is that they're not as good for skirmishing. They're not as good for ganking 9-foot spears. I already discussed this a little bit, but the difference in optimum range, the difference is a lot smaller. So it makes it harder for longer weapons to gank 9-foot spears. You can still do it, it's just difficult. The longer weapons are not as good for delaying sword and shields. Like if you've got 3 sword and shield fighters over there flanking your lines, and you go to delay them. Longer weapons are not quite as good with that. So another thing is if you've got a longer polearm and you're hanging out in the backfield, they're not as good for quickly killing. If the opponent charges and breaks through, the longer weapons are not as good for quickly killing those breakthroughs. And also, just a reminder that even with 7.5-foot spears, you don't have the reach to compete. Or even with a 7.5-foot polearm, you don't have the reach to compete with a 9-foot spear. So don't get into spear boxing matches. Shorter weapons, like 5 foot and less, they're not as good on the line because they're not as good for stabbing sword and shield opponents. You can still stab sword and shield opponents, but you have to wait till the lines are a lot closer because you don't have as much reach. They're not as good for harassing and delaying enemies, especially enemy spears. So if you're on the line and you've got a short polearm, you can still harass spears, but you're going to have a harder time with it. Lastly, they're not as good for defending your 9-foot spear buddy. So, Fiona, come help me again. So if Fiona's on spear, and I'm trying to defend her, I have to stand right next to her, or possibly even half a step ahead of her, in order to be able to defend her from enemy spears trying to kill her. And so, shorter polearms are not as good. Are not as good for defending your spear buddies. However, shorter polearms are really good for skirmishing. They're good for ganking 9-foot spears because, again, the difference in optimum range is really big. So if you can get past the spear tip, you're golden. They're good for dealing with sword and shield opponents. When we were discussing single combat versus sword and shield, I said how I prefer shorter weapons because it's easier to fight sword and shield opponents with a shorter weapon. Same applies here. If you're trying to deal with a sword and shield opponent who's flanking your line or something, then a shorter polearm is going to be easier for that. Lastly, if you're hanging out in the backfield as backup and the opponent charges and breaks through, then a shorter polearm is going to be better for killing those breakthroughs than a longer one. I also mentioned this earlier, but I'm going to reiterate it. Shorter weapons can sometimes be really good in restricted terrain battles, especially during a big push where there's not room to maneuver a longer weapon. My favorite for mass combat is actually 6-foot weapons, like medium size, around 6-foot-ish. Because I feel like they strike the best balance between being good on the line and being good for skirmishing. If you have a weapon that's somewhere in between these extremes, so say something that's like 6'6" or 6'8", then it'll be a little bit worse than a 7'6" polearm on the line, but a little bit better in skirmishing. So same applies if you got one that's shorter, so like 5'4", like this one, is going to be a little bit better. So if you compare this 5'4" to this 4'8", the longer one is going to be slightly better on the line, but slightly worse in skirmishing. So, like I said, I prefer the 6-foot because I feel like it has the best balance between line and skirmishing. Here in Artemisia, we've got the castle in Provo. We always fight we usually do at least one battle on the stairs. And on the stairs, we always restrict it to 6 foot or less because longer weapons is too easy to reach the people on the stairs. So if you like fighting at the castle in Provo, bring something 6 foot or less for the stairs. Okay, that's all I have. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions or comments, again, put them in the comments down below. I would love to hear your feedback. And so, thank you for watching, and maybe I'll catch you again sometime.